Hey, welcome to another Fundamental Friday. I'm Tyler Bourne, I work with Tyler Edlin, and sometimes he lets me commandeer his YouTube channel. Today we're going to look at a pretty fundamental concept of composition, and that is the rule of thirds. So at its core, in composition, the idea of rule of thirds is really simple. If we have a frame for an image, what we want to do is split that into thirds, both vertically and horizontally. It doesn't have to be super perfect. And the idea is that we want our focal point where we want our viewer to look. We want to place that on one of these four intersections. And that's really all there is to it. Of course, we are going to expand on that a little bit. So of course you can get much more complicated with your compositions. If you Google, old art masters composition grids or just art composition grids, you'll get some stuff like this. And this is pretty advanced stuff. Essentially what we're dealing with is rhythms. So these grids sort of create these lines and movements and rhythms that we can lean on when composing an image. So you can see in this first piece that a lot of the movements follow these rhythm lines here in the composition. So this woman here, her body is aligned with this line here. This woman lying here, the way that she's resting has her arms and head aligned with that line there. Slightly less obvious, we've got this woman here following this line, and she's also sitting within this triangle. And then we've got this woman keeping her in. So this arm sort of follows this line, and then her main gesture line is sort of this way, and her arm reaches up. So she sort of completes that triangle. And of course, overall, as sort of a more obvious large shape is this big triangle that's created between what's in light and what's in shadow. All of this is in light, and then we get these two other triangles that are in shadow, right? But if we take this complex composition and break it down more simply, we can see that we get these two sort of bright highlights against the darker image. And those brightest points in the image fall on our thirds. So a much more simple way of looking at this image is the two areas that draw our eye the most are still on our thirds. This one over here is sort of similar. Again, we get these nice rhythms happening. The foot fits into this triangle with these two lines here. We've got this leg following this line here. The neck of the guitar almost follows this line. Again, these things don't necessarily have to line up perfectly, but get pretty close. And then of course, if we do look at our thirds in this example, our third would be right here. So the head gets pretty close. It's sort of in the area. Again, it's not right on, doesn't have to be exactly in these positions. I would argue though that the point of this piece is not so much about that. It's more about the feeling of sort of feeling slightly uneasy. Overall, he feels a little bit crammed into the frame, and I think that's done intentionally to maybe give us a sense of uneasiness. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a moment. Here's some examples from film showing the rule of thirds, and you can see that our focal points are on one of those intersections. But more than that, we also get a secondary focal point, or at least an area of interest. So if we take a look here, this character is on that third, and then secondary focal point is this other character landing on the other third. Here, this character on the third, and we're also drawn to the lens of the camera. We want to see what he's looking at. We want to see what the camera is seeing. And that camera lens lands right on the third. It draws our eye. Again, this character landing on the third, and then I wouldn't necessarily call it a focal point, but we get an area of interest with this telephone here. And then this one from Pulp Fiction, one third, and then the second character is on the other third. So these are examples of primary focal point, and then either a secondary focal point or at least an area of interest. And in a little bit, we're going to look at sort of a more interesting way to look at this as well. But as a really basic example or idea, what you could do, so if you're creating an illustration, let's say you're doing some sort of landscape or something, you could have some sort of, building castle type thing here. It's beautiful, I know. Something like that, and then our little character who is making his way to this castle. And so what that gives us is our castle on the one third, and then our character as the secondary focal point on the other third. So this is used a lot where we get one main focal point, and then as a secondary point of interest, we get a little character who is clearly going to that focal point. You see this a ton, and it's because it's effective.
Hey, I wanted to thank you, Tyler B, for coming over onto the channel this week and giving everybody an awesome demo. And I wanted to let you guys know it's thanks to you and your generous support over on the Brush Sauce Patreon that we are able to make content like this possible. So of course we have links below for everything, as well as we are running, Tyler and I, the other Tyler and I, are running a group mentorship via Patreon as well. You guys can check availability on that. The newsletter, of course, has all that kind of info and upcoming release dates. With that said, I'll let Tyler get back and do his thing. Catch you guys later.
The next thing I want to talk about is examples of composition. So these examples are from Edgar Payne in his book on composition. You can Google Edgar Payne composition and you'll get a bunch of these. And these are examples of how to frame an image in interesting ways. So I do want to speak about the Steelyard one for a moment because I think it's really important, and you can sort of utilize this one in a lot of the other ones as well. But you can see that we basically get a big shape and a small shape sort of counterbalancing each other. And this starts tying into a different concept, which is big, medium, and small, where we get large shapes, medium shapes, and little tiny shapes. And the idea is to have a nice balance of those. We start to see that idea with the Steelyard, in that we get these big shapes and then we get some medium ones, and you can even potentially sneak in some smaller ones. But you want to place these in an interesting way. Note that he's got his little balance here because the large shape weighs more. It's got more visual weight to it than obviously the medium point. So the medium point needs some more blank space to help counterbalance it. You're essentially counterbalancing visual weight with areas of rest. So we almost get like a yin and yang thing happening where we get these dark shapes here. Picture the yin and yang here. Granted, this shape isn't there, but whatever. But you can see that's the sort of balance that we get out of this. It's balancing that area of density versus areas of rest. Same sort of thing happening here. Then of course, we've got a more sort of balanced shot. And then from there, we get these examples of these larger shapes dominating the composition. So the composition basically become about these larger shapes. So we've got an O or a circular composition where, we can imagine this sort of lake with some land masses, some mountains, and some trees sort of forming around that. So we get this like circular composition happening. And then in this one, we get a ring of clouds that sort of create this circle. And then our landmass completes the circle on the base there. Then we got S-curve or compound curve. I'm a huge fan of this one. It's a great way to lead your viewer into the image, but you can see here, you can see that we've got this little river snaking through the image as forming an S. Same thing here. These can also be Z curves, so you can have it be more angular if you want as well. Same sort of thing. And then it's not mentioned on this page, but you can also do the same thing with just a simple C curve. These aren't C curves, but you could have a C leading us into the image as well. And we've got these triangular shapes here. But again, when we look at these ones, I would draw your attention back to the Steelyard and say that you can sneak some of that into this composition. So if we're balancing big, medium, and small, you can see that here we have a really big shape, and then here we start to get a medium one. You can even potentially have some like little bushes or something and create small ones. So you still get the triangle, but you're also dealing with that big, medium, small, which sort of gives you the vibes of the Steelyard. Same thing here. These are kind of balanced, but we could alter them a little bit to have this one maybe be a little bit bigger. Maybe this is the small one here, and then our cloud could be like a medium shape, or maybe you could flip these. Either way, you're still playing with that big, medium, small, and you're still keeping that triangular shape overall. Next, we get the cross. This one's pretty obvious. Not much to say about it, except again, if you want to add in some nice balance to it, it's not just about the cross. You can add a little bit of that Steelyard vibe to it. We can see that even though we've got that cross, the big boat in the foreground creates a larger mass, and then we sort of get a medium one and then a smaller one there. So it's combining these a little bit. Same thing here, we get that cross, but we've got a larger tree here, let's maybe call this a medium, and then you could potentially have some smaller ones in the back there too. So big, medium, small, sort of that steel yard. You're balancing a larger shape and then balancing that large mass with some breathing room here. Next, we've got radiating lines. So we've got our focal point and then the line of clouds pointing to that focal point. This one's pretty blunt. It's very, very obvious, but basically all lines lead to our focal point. Same thing here. Here we get some curved lines, but it's basically doing the same thing. All of these lines point to the focal point. This one's an interesting one because a lot of people will sneak this in as sort of a secondary composition item where once you've got your focal point and your overall shape, you can sneak in a few other lines that point us towards that focal point, but it's sort of non-dominant. And then we've got a rectangular or L-shaped composition. And again, as you might guess, we still have that balance of mass versus area of rest. Now, I wouldn't try to compound too many of these together because they won't really work. You really want one dominant shape or message for your composition, but you can certainly combine one of these with the rule of thirds. In fact, a lot of these do have the rule of thirds. If we go back through here, this tree is our main focal point on the third. And a lot of the times with these larger shapes, in my opinion, they'll cross over two of the focal points. So you sort of get this area of two. And then in the steel yard example, you can have your secondary focal point there as a smaller item with more breathing area. Same thing here. That's falling on the third. And then we get this like little visual interest area on this third as well. Even the triangle, this big shape here, on a third, happening pretty close to the thirds there. Same thing with the boat. Third. Main tree, third. And again, I would argue these secondary points of interest fall pretty close to that other third as well, right? Main tree, third. Little house, third. And again, over and over again. These ones are a little less obvious, and that's okay, but I would argue, we have a main big tree here, still on the third. This little landmass here, that at least falls on the third there across. So let's take a look at some real life examples here. Here are two examples from Marco Bucci. And this example is pulled from his CGMA class, so I hope that's okay. Shout out to Marco and his color and light class on CGMA. So can you point out the dominant composition element here? It's the triangle here. You can see that Marco has created that triangle through the color versus light. Right? By keeping all of his light in basically one area and all the shadows in one area, he creates these dominant triangle shapes in his composition. There it is again. This example is from Sergio Castaneda, and he talked about this in his CGMA class on Blender. So this one's a little bit less obvious, but Sergio has also created a triangular composition here. Now it's maybe a little less obvious with the light versus dark here, but what he's done is he's created that triangular shape with areas of rest versus areas of high density, which is a really great way of doing it, especially for a video game like The Last of Us, where we can imagine the player sneaking around this open space, whereas everything else is sort of unplayable area. It's just high density. We don't really need to worry about that here. So by having this one area of rest play off of the areas of high density, we get this triangular composition. And then of course our eye is automatically drawn to the one bright spot in the image, which is both part of that triangle and pretty dang close to landing on our third. So again, the rule of thirds still applies here. So you can see how powerful these rule of thirds can be, especially when combined with a dominant shape or flow to the composition. Going back to our other example of the character with the castle, one thing that I'm a fan of doing is having your main focal point as you're building, your little character on the other third, and then give us a dominant shape or flow to connect the one focal point to the secondary focal point. So you can do something like a path that is an S-curve that leads us to the focal point that connects both our character and our main focal point. You can have it be a C-curve if you want as well. C-curve would work great too. Maybe it's an area of light, sort of like what we saw in Marco's examples. You can see here in this example by Tyler Edlin, we've got one focal point on one third, other focal point on another third. And overall, because of the way he handled his lighting and the path here, overall we get this big C curve. So again, it's a combination of the rule of thirds with a dominant shape. Now, speaking a little bit more about either secondary and tertiary focal points, or you can call them, secondary points of interest maybe. Here's a different way to do it that I find really interesting, and this is from one of James Pake's Gumroad tutorials, and I don't think I've seen anybody else explain it quite like this, so shout out to James Pake. So before I start this, you do want to think about your hierarchy. So if you have multiple focal points or areas of interest, that needs to be ordered in a way that makes sense so that there's no competing for our attention. We know what the primary focal point should be, and then we get just these little secondary areas of interest. So these become a hierarchy where number 1 is your primary focal point, and then 2 should draw our eye less, and that is a secondary point of interest. And then the third one, again, even less dominant than 2, would be a third point of interest. And so we've looked at examples of putting our main focal point on one of the intersections and our secondary point of interest on another, and that's fine. But here's a cool tip I learned from James Pake. Decide where your main focal point is on one of these intersections. From here, we can subdivide our grid into smaller grids of thirds. So use this focal point as a corner for a new grid. We get one grid here, and then we can split that into a third. So you can put your secondary focal point on any one of these 4 intersections. So let's try something like that. Next, again, using this as a corner, we also get a little grid here. We split that into a third. So let's try something like that. So what happens here is we start to get this flow happening between all our points of interest. They are connected and they interact with one another. It gives us a nice visual flow to the image, and it also helps with storytelling. So you notice if we have these 3 points of interest, this could be an S curve, it could be a C curve. We could have just a completely different lighting area. Maybe this triangle is an area of light, all of this is shadow, but we get, maybe a little highlight here for that guy. And these are darker areas, or something like that. The idea, again, is we can combine these rule of thirds with a dominant composition theory and get quite a nice result. If we take a look at this example from Tyler Edlin here, we can see that our main focal point is here, and that lands roughly on a third. Now there's a few interesting things here. This is our main focal point, so landing on that third, and you could just keep it like this and say, our little cavalry characters are another focal point. That also lands on a third. That's cool too. You could leave it like that. It doesn't need to get more complicated than that. But let's continue with this James Pake example. If this is also the corner of a new grid, if we split this into thirds, we get a few interesting things happening. For one, the end of this cliff basically falls on this third line, which is kind of nice. We also get this tree here, which is sort of both part of this focal point, but its own standalone item. And because it's bigger, the tree actually draws our eye a little bit more than the characters do. Again, I would argue that this is sort of all the same kind of focal point, but I'm just having fun breaking down this image with that exercise by James Pake. So we get our tree on this third. We also get a bunch of other little thirds happening. So if we take this top corner here, you can see that Tyler has chosen to place the top of this building here on that third. In fact, this creates a larger third as well. If the grid was taller than this, actually here, it still falls on that 1/3, right? That building falls on that 1/3. So I would argue that you don't need to go quite this deep with it. And just knowing the way that Tyler Edlin paints, I don't think Q is putting in these grids quite to this extent. But Tyler is experienced enough that this becomes more about flow and feeling, and the more experience you do, you can sort of do this more intuitively. And that's why a lot of this stuff is sort of happening to land on that space. But just for argument's sake, if you're newer to art, I think that it might be likely that you want some buildings in there for visual interest. But you might not know where to place them, right? You might be putting them in pretty willy-nilly without much reason. Well, the idea of these subgrids could help you decide where to place those extra items. From there, I also want to talk a little bit about flow. Now, the flow or leading the eye through an image could be a completely different discussion, and maybe we'll discuss that in a future Fundamental Friday. But while I've got this image here, I just want to show you a few things. Notice that we've got all of these lines that point us to the focal point. It's a little bit like that radial example from Edgar Payne, but we're being a little bit more subtle about it. So notice that we get a line here that points us to our focal point. This line here with the fence leads us to the focal point. Same thing with this line of the ground here, bringing us in, and then the tree bumps us up. This mountain is a good example because he could have cut it off here and had all of this been cloud here. But what that would have done then is it would have led our eye up and out of the frame, which is not what we want. We want to keep the viewer inside the frame. So by having the mountain come down like this, he points us right to the focal point. And then this is even more subtle, but look at this. See these breakups in the clouds here? These are creating subtle little lines that again take us to that focal point. So once you have a main idea for your composition and your rule of thirds, it's always nice to sneak in these lines that help draw the viewer's eye to that focal point. Let's talk about what is commonly referred to as leading room or looking room. And that's the idea that when we've got a subject, especially a person, framed, we want them to be looking into the majority of the frame. So this person here, their eyes are the focal point. They are landing on a third, but we want them to be facing in towards the rest of the picture. So you've got 2/3 here and 1/3 here, right? And you can see this is another example. It's a little bit wider, so not quite a third, but more or less she lands on that third. If we do the opposite and have a person on a third, this is an extreme example, so it's not even on the third, but if we put the person on this third here facing this way, it does one of two things. One, it makes us want to see where they're looking and it makes us want to leave the frame. Or it makes us feel claustrophobic, like we don't have enough breathing room. We also have all this extra space here that's doing no good really, and it creates a sense of discomfort. This type of shot makes us feel uncomfortable, and it's designed to do that specifically. Same thing here, we've got a lot of dead space here that's not needed. Meanwhile, this person doesn't have much area to breathe. We interpret the edge of the frame as something hard, so when we see a person right up against the frame, it starts to feel claustrophobic. This is sort of an intrinsic feeling, it's subconscious. So as you can see in these two examples here, we can use that to our advantage when we want to, but I would argue that most of the time this is more appropriate. You want your main subject looking into the majority of your image, if that makes sense. Obviously with people and characters, that's a little bit more obvious, but it still applies to say landscape paintings. You can see here in another Tyler Edlin example, we've got this building, so it lands somewhere on our third, but it's quote unquote facing the larger area of the image. If we were to instead frame it like something like this here, it's still on our third, so that's good, but we're left kind of wondering like what's happening here? Why is there so much dead space here? Overall, it makes the image weaker. Maybe one good way to think about it is instead of leading room or sort of breathing space that you might find with a character, with environments, maybe it's, we want to see how to get here. Are we traveling to this space? We need area to see that. This is where a lot of the storytelling happens, where we are arriving to the focal point. Now, finally, of course, you can break the rule of thirds. You don't necessarily have to have a focal point on a third. There are always exceptions to the rules. You can put your focal point dead center if you want. And Stanley Kubrick is a great example of that. He does so much one-point perspective in his films, and he goes out of his way to make sure that his shots are very, very symmetrical. But he does this with a very specific purpose. So you can do something like this, but I would argue that if you're going to have, say, a more central focused composition, be very, very intentful about it. Have a good reason. These types of shots are almost too perfect, so we start to get this like uncanny valley type feeling, and they can be used for a variety of things. They can be used for horror. Obviously, we've got a shot from The Shining here, but it can also be used in comedy or maybe grandness, and that's one of the reasons why maybe it's a little bit more difficult to pull off, I think, because it can send different messages, but often it does send a very strong message. So if you're going to do this, again, be very intentful and really understand the message that you're trying to put across. There's always exceptions to all of this stuff, and a lot of this is just my opinion, but I would argue that the majority of the time sticking to the rule of thirds will get you very far. If you look at the majority of artwork out there, the focal point will be on a third, and a lot of that has to do with that balance that we looked at. That Steelyard example of Edgar Payne's is really a masterclass in and of itself of understanding the balance and flow of an image. So now I want to play a quick little game that I think might be fun, and that is go on MapCrunch to random locations and see if we can just crop our images in a different way that puts our focal point more on a third, just to see if we can improve the composition purely from cropping. All right, let's go. So I'm just going to screen cap this here. So this is our shot from MapCrunch, and I do have a video on my channel talking about, doing applied studies, which means getting reference but not copying it one for one. Instead, actively try to improve upon the image and make your own image. So if I were doing something like that, we do have a nice kind of curve from the road here, but maybe I might exaggerate that to create more of a C curve to lead us into the image. Again, going back to those Edgar Payne examples. Then, maybe this tree here is our focal point. Well, it's sort of dead center right now. So if I were to paint this, maybe I'd make it bigger and put it on a third. So I do have a video on my channel about that where I'm studying, but I'm actively changing the composition of the study to make it more interesting. So if you're interested in that, go check that out. Today, I think I just want to have fun and see if we can make more interesting compositions purely out of different crops. So I do like this tree as our focal point, so let's try that here. We could do something like that. Okay, so here we go. That's our original image. And then hopefully, if I've done my job, we've made some more interesting compositions here. And again, I'm mostly focused on this tree here as our focal point. The focal point really can be anything that you want it to be. So here I basically put it on my top right third. Maybe should have framed it slightly more like this. Here, bottom right. Notice that Edgar Payne yin and yang type thing happening. Same thing here, we've got it taking up those 2/3. And then maybe this bush here is sort of secondary. And then same sort of thing here. So hopefully those are slightly more interesting compositions than just the screen grab that we got from MapCrunch. Let's try another one. Let's hit go. Of course, some of these are pretty barren and kind of hard to work with. Let's see what we get here. This one I'm not going to put too much time into, but I think that, my eye is drawn to here. So let's just frame this one a little bit differently. We do something like that. This one's actually not too bad being that far away. Maybe we just crop it a little bit. So again, we're just putting it on the third. So we've got a further shot and then one that's a little closer up. Okay, so this one's actually super interesting. I think this one works quite well because we've got this on the third. Again, if I were to paint this, maybe I'd add some trees here, a little bit more of a tree outcropping here to add some more visual interest on another third. We could crop it a little bit so that our horizon line falls roughly on the third. Not that it needs to be, we didn't really talk about that. The horizon can be pretty much anywhere, it doesn't have to land on a third. But do avoid putting it right in the middle of your image because it sort of splits the image too perfectly into two and it creates sort of a boring composition. Yeah, this one I'm quite liking because this already falls on a third. If we were to force ourselves to recrop it, we could do something like this maybe. So again, I'm going for sort of that Steelyard example here from Edgar Payne, where we've got our main mass, which is falling on a third, horizon's also kind of on a third, and then we get a little secondary interest point here, and even that third one there too. So you could shrink that down even more. And let's just quickly test this with the James Pake method too. So this could be the third for that one windmill. And then we can maybe split this into a third. And so either one of these I think would work for that third windmill. Put it either there or there. Could be kind of fun. But mostly what I'm focused on there is main shape and then a little secondary one. So this pole definitely draws our attention as one of the only vertical objects in the scene. So let's try doing something with that. So here, basically just trying to put it on a third. And then if we were to subdivide this side here, these guys kind of fall on a third there as well. These guys sort of fall on that third, which hopefully is pretty interesting. There's still a fair bit of dead space here. We also get a nice little visual interest bit here. This one here is pretty basic, but putting it on the third, and then the roof of the building also sort of acts on more or less a third. Same thing here, but this time in this little third, we get our little guys. So if I were to do a study of this, I would actually try to nudge them over a little bit to something like this here, if I could. If I could do something like that with it still making sense, that might work better. And same thing here. Same thing here. I would actually stretch this out maybe a little bit. Maybe shift them over a little. That way it's more, you know, a third and a third. So anyway, that's just a few examples and sort of a fun exercise. If you go on MapCrunch, just grab any screenshot and see if you can improve upon the composition just from cropping. And then of course you can take it further by sort of doing a study and rearranging pieces in a more interesting way. So definitely feel free to go to MapCrunch and do some studies, but when doing so, don't be afraid to make alteration and improvements upon the reference. Okay, so hopefully that helped, especially if you're just starting to get your feet wet with composition. And I hope you like the little recropping exercise in MapCrunch. If you like fundamentals and sort of beginner exercises and things like that, I also do a lot of that stuff on my own YouTube channel, so check that out. The link will be in the description below. I also co-run the group mentorship with Tyler Edlin over on his Patreon, so definitely check that out. We meet every 2 weeks and we help you build up portfolio projects. So definitely check that out if you're interested. The link to that will also be in the description. As always, thanks so much for watching. Thank you to Tyler Edlin for having me back on the channel. And let us know in the comments what you want to see in future Fundamental Fridays. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye.